Efua woke before sunrise most days. Her hut was small, the roof patched with palm leaves, and the ground beneath her feet was hard earth. She was used to hunger. Her parents had died when she was young, and she learned early that life in her village was not easy. Yet she carried herself with quiet strength. She would walk barefoot to the river each morning, balancing her clay pot on her head, moving gracefully even though her body often ached from work. The villagers knew her as a girl of few words, but they also admired her for never giving up. That afternoon the sun was heavy, filling the air with heat. Efua's pot was nearly full when she saw dust rising in the distance. At first she thought it was a herd of cattle being driven along the road. But as the figures drew closer, she saw horses, richly decorated carriages, and attendants dressed in bright cloth. Her heart skipped. It was not ordinary travelers, it was the royal family of the Benin kingdom passing through. People whispered stories of the palace, of its high walls and treasures, but Efua had never seen royalty with her own eyes until that day. She stepped off the narrow path, lowering her head respectfully. The procession slowed, and Efua caught sight of a young royal child. His face was tired, his small frame bent forward, and his lips were dry. The boy looked no older than her younger brother had been before sickness took him years ago. Efua felt a tug at her heart. She lowered her pot of water, knelt, and without hesitation lifted the gourd toward the boy. The attendants frowned at first, unsure if a poor village girl should approach. But the child reached out with trembling hands, and Efua gently guided the water to his lips. The boy drank slowly, then smiled faintly, his strength returning. Efua's heart warmed at the sight, though she quickly stepped back, bowing low to show respect. The child's mother, a royal woman with a calm but watchful gaze, had seen everything. She leaned forward in her carriage and asked softly, "What is your name, girl?" Efua's voice was steady, though her hands shook. "Efua, my queen." The royal woman studied her. There was no fear in Efua's eyes, only kindness and honesty. It was a small moment, but in that moment, Efua's life began to shift. The carriages moved on, the horses clattered against the road, and soon the dust settled once more. Efua stood with her empty pot, watching them fade into the distance. She thought it was over. To her, it was just an act of kindness, a simple offering of water to a thirsty child. But what she did not know was that her name and her face had already entered the memory of the royal family. That one act had unknowingly tied her fate to the palace, a world far beyond the struggles of her poor village. When she returned home that evening, villagers asked about the procession, their eyes wide with curiosity. Efua only smiled faintly and said little. She did not feel the need to boast, nor did she believe anything would come from such a small act. She sat alone in her hut that night, the moonlight spilling across the floor, and whispered a prayer for strength. Life would go on, she thought. Tomorrow she would wake again to fetch water. But destiny had already begun to move. The road she thought she knew so well, the path from her hut to the river, was slowly leading her toward the palace gates. Efua never expected that the royal family would remember her. Weeks passed after the day she gave water to the young prince, and she continued her life in the village, carrying pots from the river and selling small bundles of firewood. But one morning a group of attendants arrived at her hut. They wore fine robes, their sandals clean and bright. They announced that the queen herself had sent for her. Efua's heart raced. She did not know if she should feel honored or afraid. The villagers gathered around, whispering in awe. Some envied her, some worried for her safety, but all eyes followed as Efua was led away toward the palace. The path was long, and her feet, used to the dust of the village, now stepped on smooth stones near the grand gates. When she finally entered, the sight before her nearly stole her breath. The palace was like another world. The walls were high and covered with carvings that told stories of kings and warriors. Courtyards stretched wide, with fountains flowing and trees casting shade over polished tiles. Servants moved quickly, each with a task. Guards stood tall, their spears shining in the sun. Efua had never seen so much gold, so many rich fabrics, or so many rules written in every movement. At first she felt small, like a bird caught in a cage too grand for its wings. The attendants gave her clean clothes, softer than anything she had ever worn. They taught her how to bow at the right times, how to stand in silence, and how to walk without raising her eyes too high. Efua obeyed quietly, though her heart longed for the freedom of her village. Days turned into weeks, and Efua began to notice things others ignored. The palace looked perfect from the outside, but within the walls, cracks appeared. She saw how some servants whispered behind each other's backs, their voices sharp with jealousy. She noticed how wives of the royals competed for attention, their smiles hiding rivalry. Even among the princes she felt tension, as though every smile was heavy with secrets. The young prince she had once helped often passed her in the courtyards. He remembered her kindness and greeted her with warmth, but his attendants quickly pulled him away. Efua realized even he was not free. Royal children lived under watchful eyes, their every step judged. One evening as she carried water into the women's quarters, Efua overheard a quarrel. Two palace wives argued in hushed tones, their words filled with bitterness about inheritance and favor. The moment they noticed Efua, they fell silent, their eyes cold as if warning her never to repeat what she had heard. Efua bowed and left quickly, her heart heavy. The more she stayed, the more she understood that the palace was built not only on stone and gold but also on silence. Secrets floated through the air like invisible threads, tying everyone together but choking them at the same time. Servants who saw too much kept their heads down. Those who spoke unwisely disappeared from sight. Efua, though powerless, learned to listen without reacting, to see without being seen. She became a quiet witness, her eyes catching details others missed. She saw the sadness in the queen's face when she thought no one was looking. She saw the anger hidden in the eldest prince's jaw when his father praised another child. She saw how gifts and favors could turn brothers into rivals. At night, when she lay on her mat in the servants' quarters, Efua thought of her village. She missed the simple laughter of children, the freedom of the open sky, the sound of crickets by her hut. But she also knew that fate had placed her here for a reason. Perhaps her life was no longer only about survival. Perhaps she was meant to witness the truth behind the palace walls. Still, the palace was not without kindness. Some servants treated her like a sister, teaching her ways to move unnoticed, ways to carry herself with dignity. The queen herself, though distant, once paused to ask Efua if she was settling in well. That small moment gave Efua courage. Yet in her heart she knew the palace was dangerous. The gold and silk could not hide the shadows. And though she was only one small woman among many, Efua felt the weight of the secrets pressing down on her. She did not speak of what she saw. She kept her silence, her eyes open, her spirit steady. And so, Efua, the poor village girl who once fetched water from the river, became a quiet keeper of untold stories, walking carefully through a world where one word could change everything. Prince Ikena was different from the others. While most of the royals kept their distance from the servants, he often sought out Efua, speaking to her in moments when the palace halls were quiet. At first, Efua was afraid to answer him. She knew the rules. Servants did not share words with princes unless spoken to, and even then their replies had to be brief. But Ikena's voice was gentle, his eyes honest, and slowly, Efua found herself listening more. One evening, as the lamps flickered low and the sound of drums echoed faintly from a distant courtyard, Ikena leaned closer to Efua. His voice trembled with worry as he spoke of whispers he had overheard. Someone within the palace, he feared, was plotting against the royal family. Efua felt her chest tighten. She looked into his young eyes and saw not the confidence of a prince but the fear of a child trapped in a world too heavy for his shoulders. Her first thought was silence. She was only a servant, what could she possibly do? The palace was filled with powerful people, each word carefully measured. If she dared to repeat Ikena's fears, she might be accused of lying or worse, of scheming herself. She had seen what happened to servants who were suspected of knowing too much. Some disappeared without a trace. Others returned broken, their spirits crushed. But Ikena trusted her. That trust burned in her heart. She remembered the day she had offered him water, not knowing it would bind her to his fate. Now he was offering her something far heavier, his secret. Days passed, and Efua began to notice things she had ignored before. Certain guards lingered in shadows too long, their eyes sharp as if watching more than protecting. Some attendants whispered together and fell silent when others entered the room. Even in the queen's chamber, Efua felt the air thick with unspoken tension. Her courage grew, but so did her fear. Every night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, asking herself what she should do. She was powerless, yet her silence could mean danger for the very people who had shown her small kindness. One afternoon, while she was arranging fabrics in one of the royal chambers, Ikena appeared again. His face was pale, his hands shaking. "Efua," he whispered, "promise me you will not leave me alone in this. I do not know who to trust. But I trust you." Efua's heart ached at his words. She had never imagined a prince would look to her, a poor servant from a forgotten village, for safety. She placed her hand gently on his, careful not to cross the line of respect. "You are not alone, my prince," she said softly. From that moment, Efua began to watch more carefully. She noticed how one of the older courtiers always avoided the king's gaze, yet seemed to linger near the younger princes. She saw how letters were passed in the dark, hidden beneath trays of food or tucked into the folds of robes. She said nothing, but she remembered everything. Fear sat heavy in her chest. She knew if she misstepped, it would not only be her life at risk but Ikena's as well. Yet her spirit, once beaten by poverty and hunger, now found new strength. She could not fight with weapons or stand in the council of chiefs, but she could use her eyes, her ears, and her silence. Her courage was tested one night when she stumbled upon two men speaking in hurried whispers near the outer courtyard. They spoke of the king's illness, of power soon shifting, and of loyalties that could be bought. Efua froze in the shadows, her heart racing, every instinct telling her to run. But she stayed, listening, holding her breath. When the men walked away, she slipped quietly back to her quarters, her mind heavy with what she had heard. She wanted to tell Ikena, but fear stopped her. What if he told the wrong person by mistake? What if her words were traced back to her? Still, she could not bear the thought of betrayal swallowing the boy who trusted her. The next day she found him sitting under a tree in the courtyard, his face lined with worry though he was so young. She sat beside him, careful not to be seen as too familiar, and whispered, "There are truths in this palace that even the walls hide. You must be strong. But be careful who you trust. Not all who bow are loyal." Ikena looked at her with wide eyes. He understood her meaning, though she spoke carefully. He squeezed her hand for just a moment before standing and walking back into the palace, his shoulders heavier but his resolve clearer. Efua watched him go, her heart torn between fear and duty. She was just a servant, but her silence or her words might change the course of the kingdom. For the first time in her life, she realized her place in the palace was not an accident. She had been brought here for something greater. And as the sun set over the tall walls of the Benin kingdom, painting the sky in red and gold, Efua whispered a silent vow to herself. She would not let fear rule her. She would stand in courage even if it meant standing alone. Efua had always tried to walk with her head down in the palace, blending into the silence, moving quietly so that no one noticed her. But sometimes silence itself speaks louder than words. The Queen Mother, Idia, was a woman who saw more than others did. She had eyes sharp as the morning sun and a heart that weighed the truth carefully. Slowly she began to notice Efua, the way the girl listened without speaking, the way her eyes caught small details others ignored. One morning, Idia called Efua into her private chamber. Efua's legs trembled as she entered, for no servant was summoned to the Queen Mother without reason. The room was filled with rich cloths, brass ornaments, and the scent of burning herbs. Idia's voice was calm but firm. "Child, I have watched you. You carry more courage in silence than many do in speech. Tell me, what have you seen?" Efua's lips pressed together, fear closing her throat. But then she remembered Ikena's trust and the whispers she had overheard in the shadows. Slowly, in a trembling voice, she told Idia of the men's secret conversation, of the courtiers who exchanged letters in the dark, of the unease she felt in the palace halls. She spoke carefully, never adding more than what she knew. Idia listened without interruption, her face unreadable, her fingers tapping lightly against the armrest of her chair. When Efua finished, silence filled the room. Then Idia leaned forward, her eyes burning like fire. "You have done well," she said. "This palace breathes lies and truth often hides. But the kingdom does not stand on lies, it stands on truth. You will help me bring it forward." From that day, Efua no longer felt alone. Idia's quiet guidance gave her strength. Together they watched, listened, and gathered what they needed. It was dangerous work, for the traitor moved carefully, weaving deceit like a spider spinning its web. But with Idia's wisdom and Efua's courage, the threads of betrayal began to unravel. The day of truth came faster than Efua expected. The palace gathered in the great hall, its high pillars towering over the crowd. The king sat on his throne, his face pale from illness but his eyes sharp with command. Courtiers, chiefs, and guards filled the room, their voices murmuring like restless bees. Efua stood quietly near the back, her heart pounding. She had never seen so many eyes fixed on the throne. Suddenly, Idia stepped forward. Her voice carried like a drumbeat as she presented evidence. The letters, the whispers, the testimonies. Gasps spread through the hall. Efua's chest tightened as all eyes turned toward the accused, a high-ranking courtier who had long been respected. His face twisted with fear and anger as Idia spoke his name. The man tried to deny it, his voice rising, but the truth was now stronger than his lies. Guards brought forth the proof, and witnesses spoke boldly. Efua felt her knees weaken as the hall erupted in shock. The traitor's plan, once hidden in shadows, now lay bare before the king. For a moment the palace stood frozen. The man who had plotted against the throne knelt in shame, his power stripped away. The king, though weary, raised his hand and the hall fell silent. His voice, though faint, carried the weight of authority. Loyalty is the crown of this kingdom. Betrayal has no place here. Efua watched with wide eyes, her heart racing. She had thought her part would remain hidden forever, but Idia's gaze turned toward her, steady and proud. The Queen Mother spoke again, her voice echoing across the chamber. This truth would have remained buried if not for the courage of one who had nothing yet gave everything. Efua stepped forward. Gasps rose from the crowd. Efua's feet felt heavy, but she moved slowly toward the front. She bowed deeply, her hands trembling. She had never stood before the king, never imagined her name would be spoken in the great hall. The king's tired eyes softened as he looked at her. Even the lowliest hand can lift a kingdom, he said quietly. In that moment, Efua felt the weight of her journey, the hunger of her childhood, the fear of her first steps in the palace, the whispers in the dark. All of it had led to this. She was no longer invisible. The palace, the kingdom, and the royal family now knew her role. The traitor was taken away, the court shaken to its roots. But amid the chaos, Efua stood as a reminder that even in the grandest halls, truth could come from the humblest voice. Efua stood in the great hall of the palace, her head bowed as the king's voice echoed through the chambers. He did not speak of her as a servant. He did not call her poor or weak. Instead, he praised her for the courage she had shown when silence would have been safer. The Queen Mother smiled at her, her eyes filled with pride. Efua's heart trembled, not because of fear this time, but because of the honor she felt rising inside her. She had come to the palace as a girl with nothing, and now she was leaving with something no riches could replace: respect. When the guards opened the great doors, Efua stepped outside. The sky was painted with gold from the setting sun, and the air felt lighter than it had in months. She returned to her village not with jewels or fine clothing, but with her head held high. The children of the village ran to her, curious about the whispers they had heard. "That is Efua," the elders said, "the one who stood with courage when others were silent." Her people welcomed her back with open arms, proud to call her their own. Life in the village was still simple. She fetched water from the stream, tended to her small farm and shared meals with neighbors. But something had changed. People came to her, seeking guidance, as though the courage she carried had become a light for others. She did not see herself as a hero, but in the eyes of the village she was more than that. She had proven that strength was not measured in wealth or power but in the heart's ability to stand for truth. As the years passed, Efua's story spread far beyond her village. Travelers carried it to other towns, and soon the name of the humble young woman reached corners of the kingdom she had never seen. Some told the tale as a story of bravery, others as a lesson for rulers, that wisdom could come from the most unexpected places. Children grew up hearing her name and they whispered to one another, "Efua chose truth when silence was easier." Efua herself grew older, her hair turning gray and her steps becoming slower. Yet her spirit never weakened. Even in her old age, she spoke kindly to the young, reminding them that no one was too small to make a difference. She often told them, "Courage does not need riches. It lives in every heart that chooses what is right." The children listened, wide-eyed, carrying her words with them into the future. The royal family did not forget her either. Messengers sometimes arrived in her village, bringing greetings from the Queen Mother. They would say, "The palace remembers you, Efua. You are not forgotten." Though she never sought their gifts or titles, she cherished the thought that her name had found a place in the memory of the kingdom. On quiet nights, Efua would sit outside her small home, looking at the stars. She thought of the day she had offered water to a thirsty child, never knowing how that single act would change her life. She thought of the fear she had once felt in the palace, and how that fear had given way to courage. She smiled softly to herself, knowing that her journey had not been in vain. And so, when people spoke of the Benin kingdom, they did not only speak of its kings and queens. They spoke of Efua, the orphan girl who became a woman of courage. Her story lived on, not written in gold or carved in stone, but carried in the hearts of those who believed that bravery could rise from the humblest places. The memory of Efua became a flame passed from one generation to the next. Her name was a reminder that no matter how small or poor a person might seem, their courage could shape the fate of many. The end.